All right, everyone, it is now 10 past 10, so we can get started. Unfortunately, looks like the microphone is out of battery, so I'm going to try and talk a little bit louder. Hopefully you all will be able to hear me. If not, just let me know and I can try to speak louder, okay? So happy Friday and welcome back to 426. This is lecture 6. All right, so I want to get started with some announcements. So this slide is the wording is slightly off because this originally was supposed to be Wednesday's content. So as mentioned in the announcement on Tuesday, AO2 calculator is due on Monday. How many of you is it for those who have started? Is it going well or like medium, like okay or bad? Thumbs up side. Pretty good. Okay. So this will be due on Monday. Now, again, it's due one day later because it was assigned on Tuesday rather than Monday. So there is office hours today, and then there will also be office hours on Monday in case you are looking to get help on the assignment. Okay. So that is due. Reading 4 on HTTP APIs is due on Sunday. And then also the lecture video from Wednesday is the kind of watching that and that very short async activity, which is basically just drawing something that we talk about in lecture. That will be due tonight, I believe, at Friday. The reason why we had an async video instead of just canceling entirely is because the next midterm or the first midterm is next Friday, and I wanted to have Wednesday free to be able to do any review or answer any questions in class. I didn't want to push content back, so hopefully that is all right. And if you have any questions on that content, we will be able to answer that in office hours as well. Okay. And also there's review material, which I'll show in a minute. Any questions on the announcements? All right. So as I mentioned, midterm 1 is a week away. So it's on Friday. It's in here. It's 10% only of the overall grade. It is it's on paper. So bring a pencil, and there's many different types of questions, a multiple choice, short answer, etc. No extensive code writing though, so you don't have to worry about memorizing a bunch of syntax and doing all of that. So content, the list of content and what's pretty much going to be on the exam is on the website. So I want to show you this. If we go to one of these windows, there we go. This is the course website. And so you'll see now at the bottom in the supplemental materials, the supplement 3, midterm 1, details and practice. Okay. So if you press on this, there is some details about the format, the content. So basically every part, there's a short description of what every part will be about. For some of the ones that are a little bit more intensive, there are practice questions that I've made and posted solutions to those. So you can try those out. Like DOM diagramming, something we're actually going to be doing today. And then more stuff here. Another thing to note here is this motivation section. So, this course and web development in general has so many different tools, hundreds, not thousands. If you work in industry, you'll see many, many different things related to web development. And so part of this, the goal of this course, is not just to teach how to use certain tools, but why we use them, right? So I added some discussion questions here. So I would recommend just checking these out and be able to answer maybe a short blurb of writing about why, for example, why do we use TypeScript over JavaScript or any of the others? So these are just some questions that will help to guide your study on that part. And then there's also some code tracing practice questions as well. And then also just to summarize, I have kind of made bullet points for all of the content that has been covered throughout all of the slides. So if you want to kind of quickly scroll through rather than going through every slide, you can look through here to see what we covered. This should be up to date. And once I get lesson 6 and 7 made, or once we have the recording for that, I'll post that too. Okay. Any questions about this? All right. I don't think, whoops, there we go. I don't think that you all will have to worry too much if you look at that document and kind of read through it. I think it should be fine. And then, sorry, another note is that the last day of material that will show up on the midterm will be Monday. So you'll have Monday afternoon all the way until Friday to be able to digest the material. We'll probably just do some review on Wednesday, nothing new there. All right, so with that and talking about the midterm, I think we can now get started with the actual content for today. So to recap so far, as we have been talking over the last few days, and we've talked about the fact that HTML helps us to provide the structure and the content for web pages. CSS helps to provide styling. And then together, HTML and CSS combined help us to make layouts. Okay? And we talked about kind of last time we were together last week that the missing piece in this puzzle here, we have 2 out of the 3 things, but the one thing we were missing was functionality. And we said that functionality would be provided using TypeScript and the TypeScript programming language. Now, we spent a lot of time last lecture talking about kind of how to set up the tooling for TypeScript, how our projects can actually use TypeScript to run. And then in the video lecture on Wednesday, we talked a little bit more about TypeScript language features, being higher order functions and closures and all of that. So today we're actually going to combine everything, and we're going to actually see how we can use TypeScript to make our web page actually do something. And so that's kind of the missing piece here, and this will help us to drive into the material after the midterm too. Okay. So the first thing that, in terms of functionality and trying to add functionality to our website, we need to be able to respond to what we call events. And events basically are just, they're a word to describe user interaction. So how a user actually interacts with the site in some way. And so this is kind of broad here, and I talk about user interaction. So I would like you to talk amongst yourselves 3 to 5 minutes and just brainstorm what are some ways that users actually interact with a web page. What might we consider to be user interaction? So we'll give a few minutes for that, and then we'll come back together and discuss. Okay. All right, we gave a few minutes to that. There's some good discussion. Does anyone have any thoughts as to how users may interact with a site? Yeah. Click buttons. Yes, exactly. That's one of the most common interactions that happens. Then, yeah, yep. Yes, exactly. Clicking links, another one. Yeah. Hover over items. Yes, very good. Sorry? Yes, search bar. So typing. That's a very very common one, using the keyboard, typing into different like form elements. So if you're, for example, filling in your name on a form, you type that into a box. Exactly. So these are all different types of user interactions. And I have a list here. I think most of these we talked about. So clicking on element, pressing a key on the keyboard. So for example, if you're playing Wordle, for example, and you're typing in letters and they start to appear, that's an example of an interaction. Dragging elements across the screen. So there's various cases where various websites that have that. And then exactly, so hovering, submitting a form, and many, many more. And actually, if you click on this link here, there's a pretty interesting, there's this pretty interesting article which talks about all these different types of potential user interactions. Right? So for example, mouse up is another one, like when a user releases their mouse buttons, they may click, but then when they release their mouse, that might be one. Another one is playing media, so pressing the start button or pause button on music or on a video. So there are a lot of different types of user interactions. Now, the key idea here is that if we consider these user interactions as what we note as events, we may want to run some sort of TypeScript code whenever the user actually tries to interact with our site, right? Or interact with maybe a specific element. And so, for example, we might want to send an alert to the user when they press a button, or maybe interact, change a component in some way. And so we've talked about defining elements in HTML, right? So HTML provides our content, provides our structure for our page. And so all of the elements that exist on a page are defined in HTML, not in TypeScript, right? So the key question here is how do we connect the two, and how do we run, for example, TypeScript code whenever an HTML element is interacted with? Okay? And so the first thing that we have to do, though, is we have to find a way to reference our HTML inside of the TypeScript code, right? Because right now they're completely independent. We have like a script tag which helps load it up, but we don't really have a way in TypeScript, or at least with the tools we have right now, to actually look at specific and kind of access specific elements. And so that is what we call the DOM is for. So I'm not sure if this terminology, I don't know how familiar people are, if they've heard of this before, but the DOM stands for the Document Object Model. And basically, it's a representation in our TypeScript code of the elements on our web page. And so we'll see in a minute that the structure of our web page and all of our elements end up making a tree. And we represent the state of our web page using a tree. And so therefore, then every node on this tree is as accessible, every element is then accessible as an object from our TypeScript code. Right? So if you have a tree for all of our elements, every node is an element, and then we can access those nodes to pick out specific elements in our code. Okay. Any questions on this? I'm going to show an example in a second. All right. So here is an example of some HTML. Right? So you can see here that we have a body. I've removed the head tag entirely. That way it doesn't conflate our example here. I have two divs, and inside of the first div, I have a paragraph, and then inside of the second one, we have a link, right, using an A element. And so how would we represent this data, or how we represent this website as a tree of objects? And so we end up with something like this. In our TypeScript code. So this is what's known as a DOM tree. So I'm going to see if I can, sometimes my writing here turns off. So let me see if I can get it to work. Sometimes, okay, that's fine. So this right here is known as a DOM tree right here. And the first thing that we have at the top of our tree always, so no matter any tree that you have, you'll always have a document element at the top. So that's kind of what we consider to be our root node. So we'll always have document at the top. So this is our root node. This is how we access the DOM. And then underneath it, we usually have a root element, which is almost always HTML. And so if you're ever drawing a tree, you can kind of add these two things by default. Right? And then underneath, we have elements. So kind of like how we have this nested HTML, we end up having this nested structure where we have these element nodes. And anytime an element is the content of another element, so for example, this paragraph right here is inside of this div, then the paragraph is going to be a child of the div node, right? Like this. And then we also have the content being text. So if we have text here, text is its own node. So for example, we have this div right here. Inside of the div, we have a paragraph. And then inside of the paragraph, we end up having this text, right? So this is the text that is inside of the paragraph. And so you can see then that this high text node is a child of the paragraph. And the same thing applies for any attributes that we add. So attributes are also an item in our DOM tree. So for example, right here, I have this href equals URL, right? This is a property, or an attribute of my A tag, because it's in that first, right? It's in my opening tag right here. And so we also represent this as a node in our DOM tree. And we write two things. We write an attribute, which is, in this case, it's href, that's the name of our attribute, and then the value that's associated with that attribute. So in this case, I have a string URL, and so that's my value right here. Right, so I have href, and then I have value. So for example, if I had something like ID equals hi, right, on this A tag as well, we would have another child here that's like attribute ID, and then value hi, like so. And so what we end up with here is this physical, like object-based representation in our TypeScript code that we can access from our HTML. And our browser is responsible for generating this tree. So whenever it loads the HTML on the browser, it's going to generate this object tree, this DOM tree, that then our HTML, or sorry, then our TypeScript code can access. So that's how the HTML and TypeScript are able to interact with each other. Does anyone have any questions on this tree here? Yeah.
So is this automatically created every time you have an HTML file, or do you have to like put in a line of code to make this tree?
Good question. Yeah, so this is automatically generated. So whenever the browser loads the HTML file, it's going to create a JavaScript object, which contains all of this. And it's accessible. There'll be a special variable in JavaScript called document, which will allow you to access the tree. So it's automatically made. Yep. Good question. Yeah.
Like they're actually like nodes like under the hood, right? So like
Mhm.
I guess like the DOM define types for like text, like attributes like hrefs and stuff like that.
Mhm. So yes, each element, I think under the hood, there's a specific type. I think it might be something like DOM element. I'm not entirely sure if that's the exact type that's defined, but yes, all of these are individual nodes. We write this, we write these different pieces so that JavaScript knows like which elements or which items are elements, which items are content or attributes. And there are different functions in JavaScript that allow us to access items based on kind of their type. So elements or attributes, etc. Yeah. Each. I think okay. I think each node here is an object that's accessible. Elements are one of the types of nodes that we can have. Okay. Very good questions. Any others? All right. So this is one example. And so what I would like you to do is so this is one example. I'm going to give a new HTML, and we're going to have everyone kind of pair up and try and draw a DOM tree. So I have this here, and don't worry, I have all the, oops, I forgot that there are some comments I had here. So DOM tree always starts with a document node. Root element HTML has a special label. All child elements of an element are placed as children in the tree. Text has its own node and attributes have its own node. So basically what I had said. Okay. So we have paper. So I've written here on the side all the different types of elements. That way you don't have to worry about memorizing that. And even on the midterm, for example, I will say ahead of time that if we ask you to draw a DOM tree, we will give you those elements. So you don't have to memorize the exact name of these. But we have this paper here, and what we'll try and do is we'll split this up. We'll try and pair everyone up. And so there should be 12 chairs in each row. So to kind of force you all to interact, we'll give 6 papers per row, and we'll see how that works. My math might be wrong, and so if it's wrong, then we'll try again. Yeah, sure. Sorry, here, I can take it for you. No. Yeah.
That's what I said.
Okay, yeah, that's all right. All right, I see very few pencils moving. If you're still working, feel free to continue because we're going to do this together. The attendance check will be open until the end of class. So you have a lot of time to take that photo. You can also add your group members to that photo if you want and have a group submission. All right. So let's try and do this. We'll try and do this together here. So I'm going to, given now this HTML, can draw out our tree, and you can compare and see how some of you are, and hopefully I don't mess anything up. All right, so to get started, as we mentioned at the top, so whoops, see if I can get my, there we go. Okay, so the first thing that we have on the top of our DOM tree, remember, is document. So let me see if I can write this here. Documents. I want to try and do this as neat as possible. Okay, so document at the top. I'll try to, I guess I won't, well, maybe I'll be able to. Actually, no, I'm going to not try and draw boxes around these things. I'll just write it out. It saves some time. All right, so we have document. That's the first thing. Does anyone know what comes underneath document? What child should document have? Yeah. Yes, exactly. Which type of node would that be? Exactly. So I'll add here a child. That's not easy to read. Sorry, my color coding here will kind of get a little bit off because, okay. Root element HTML, correct? Okay. And then from here, we have a element beneath it, which is body. So element body. And now what should come next? Any ideas? What's underneath body? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Exactly. Mm-hmm. Exactly. Perfect. So you can see here, everyone, that underneath body with H1, P, and div. So those can be our direct children here. So this is, I'll abbreviate LM H1, LM P, and LM div. Okay. Now, for our H1, the only thing that's underneath that is going to be a text. And this text is welcome to comp 426, right? So that's underneath our H1. Now for P, our paragraph, we have two different items, right? So first thing that we have, you notice right here, we have an attribute, right? Of ID equals text. And so we'll want to add that attribute here. So I'll abbreviate attribute ID, and then value is text, right? So this is just, we're working on this element. Whoops, we're working on this element right here. And then we want to have our other side of our branch here is going to be our text. And the text is hello world. Okay. Everything good so far? Perfect. And now we have an interesting one. So this div here, and unfortunately, I don't have the most amount of space to work, but what would be the children of this div right here? The direct children underneath. Yeah. Exactly. Very good. So, yep, attribute. And this is a class. Value is row. And then we also have two paragraphs. So element P and element P. And then finally, we can finish this up and have text of A01 and text of A02. Kind of threw you all into the deep end on this one. This is a pretty large tree. But hopefully, once you start to get familiar with working on these types of trees, no matter how large they are, really your limiting factor is just the space on your paper. Because the key thing is once you're able to go kind of level by level, then drawing the tree is not that bad. And I'll say that nothing larger, like if we ask this, and you'll see there's practice questions. So I think there's 5 of these that you can try out in the midterm review. And there's the last one is really large. Something that large will not be, on the midterm, it would probably be something maximum this size or less. Okay. Any questions on the DOM tree? Great. All right. So again, make sure that you have a photo to submit before class ends, that we get counted for attendance for today. But yeah, so now we have the DOM, which is this tree of objects of the nodes that represent what our HTML should look like. And so just like at the top of our tree right here, we have this document node. We can access this document in our TypeScript using just the keyword document. And it's actually interesting. This is built in. So just like console, right? When you do console.log, or I think we did window.alert was one that we did an example to kind of show a pop-up on the screen. Document is another built-in kind of keyword that we can access from JavaScript or TypeScript. All right? And so we can now directly access elements by using the document like object methods. And so there's many different methods that this document object has. Get element by ID is one of the most commonly used ones, but there are many different ways that you can kind of get a bunch of elements together, right? So what we can do is with this code, we can actually pick out an HTML element from our DOM tree, from HTML, and then save it to a variable, right? We then save a reference here. And so that is very powerful because it allows us then to directly modify the DOM and therefore modify what appears on our website. And so I'm going to open up this Stack Blitz. You can follow along. We don't have to. All of the solution actually for this. So all the code that I'll write today is also in the midterm review because it's helpful. So let me hide this. How do I, okay, stop annotating, hide controls. They're not going away. I'll quit. Quit. Okay, there we go. So this is, I'm not sure why this page is not loading. I already have it loaded here, so hopefully the internet's working. This is a sample site. Let me see if I can make this bigger. And I have, it's not L5 anymore, it's L6, but we have this event handling, and we have 3 things on here. We have a title, or sorry, we have a paragraph that says current count 0, and then we have 2 buttons, add element and increment counter, right? And so if I want to now access these elements from my TypeScript code, so you can kind of see here, this is my HTML, and I'll kind of try and see what I can do in terms of getting these side by side. There we go. Okay, so I have my HTML on the left and my blank TypeScript file on the right. So if I wanted to, for example, access this particular button, this increment counter button, and I want to have a reference to it in my TypeScript code, all I have to do is just say something like const, right? Whoops. Const increment button equals document. And you can see that document here is, we can autocomplete because it is built in. So document dot, and you can see there's many different things here, but there's get element by ID. There's also other things like get element by class name, but we'll do ID. And we'll select our button by putting this ID in there. And so this is one of the key reasons why we also have IDs, not just for CSS, but because applying IDs makes it very easy to grab elements in our code. Now, another thing that you'll see here, and this is in TypeScript. In JavaScript, you wouldn't have this. You'll want to add an exclamation point at the end of this line, I believe. Let's see why this is. Oh, okay. Well, it's saying that I haven't used it anywhere, but you will want to still add this exclamation point. And the reason is because TypeScript by default will say, well, that element may exist, right? I'm trying to look for an element. And so it could return the element if it's there, but if it's not there, it's going to return null, basically. So the type then of my increment button variable becomes this, what we call a union type, where it's like either an element or it's null, and that makes life a little bit difficult. So since we know for sure that this button is here, by adding the exclamation point, we basically tell TypeScript that I am sure that this value exists, so you can just treat it like an element. You won't have to worry about it ever being null. And so that's why we'll add that exclamation point. And this now I can access my button directly. And I can add some other ones. Like I have this count label right here. I don't know what happened to my site and why it's, oh, because I think, wait. My HTML disappeared. Let me see if I can get it open on a different tab. There we go. Okay, we're back. I'm not sure why Stack Blitz glitched out there. And I can also, for example, say const like count label document.getElement by ID. And span is a pretty interesting element because it's basically is like this wrapper that you can apply attributes to like content most of the time. So like if I wanted just that 0 to be an element on its own and give it an ID so I can access that number, I can just kind of wrap it in this span. So I can add count. So I now have access to these elements in our code, but how do we do anything with them, right? Because right now we have access to these objects, but we still haven't really made our page interactive. And so we go back over here. And okay, so again, going back to that key idea, we want to run some TypeScript code when a user interacts with our element. It's the same example I had before. And now we have a way to actually reference our HTML elements from our TypeScript code. We can do that using the DOM. And so finally, now that we have a variable that stores an element, we can now add something called an event handler. Okay. And an event handler looks something like this. So if we have some element variable that is stored right here, I can use this method add event listener. And there's two parts. One is a string that represents a specific event. So click is one of them, right? That's a user interaction when a user clicks on this element. And then we have this arrow function that's passed in where whenever this event occurs, this function is going to run. Right? So whenever somebody clicks on my element, the code in here will then fire off and run, right? And so if you remember from, see here, text representation of the event, arrow function. This is the reason why we introduced higher order functions in the reading, because this is an example of a higher order function, right? A higher order function is just a function that takes in either another function as a parameter or returns a new function. And in this case, add event listener is a method, right? But then as a parameter, we're supplying some function, right? That's the function that whenever this event happens, it's going to run. And so as I had shown in earlier, I think it's the same page, all of these are potential events. So this is the string representation for a specific event. So click was one, right, that we had. Let me see if I can. There we go. See, click is the one. So whenever somebody clicks on an element, there's another one like, I think, hover, as someone mentioned in class. Actually, it's probably mouse over. Is there a mouse over? Yeah. So mouse over means that you are, right, the mouse is over the element. There's different ones like mouse enter. So whenever you enter the bounds of an element, or mouse up or mouse wheel. So all these different, various different types of user interactions are defined here. And so we can use event handlers and this document variable that stores our DOM to now add functionality. And so I want to jump into an example, but does anyone have any questions on this here before we show it actually working? All right, so let's now show a example. We'll go back to StackBlitz, which is somewhere. There we go. So I have my increment button and I have my count label. And my website right now has this count of 0. And what I want to do is whenever I press this increment counter button, I want that number to increase. Right? So the first thing that we can do is we could define some sort of variable that holds our count. So if I just say like let count equals 0, because that's the initial count that I've set up here. It's 0. Now, if I want my button, my increment button, to run some code when I click on it, what would I have to do? Well, I'd have to use that event handler syntax. So I can say increment button dot add event listener. And remember, this takes in 2 things, and I think it even shows here. So first is the type of event, which is click. And then the next thing is that arrow function, the function that we want our code to run whenever we press this button. So I can do something like this. And if I wanted, just to show that this works, I can say like window.alerts, button pressed. I'll save. And if I go back here, I think if I press, there we go. So you can see now an alert appears on the screen when my button has been pressed. Right? So that shows that we can connect that click event to some action. But now let's say that instead of just showing an alert, I want to increment my counter, right? So I want to make count plus equals 1. Right? So that increases my counter variable up here. Now, of course, when I go in, I try and run this, right? Nothing's going to happen because I am incrementing this variable, but I'm not changing this HTML in any way to reflect that my counter has changed. And so now, using my count label reference, I can say something like count label, and then a very interesting here, inner HTML. So inner HTML is it's a variable on this label that basically says, or it stores everything that goes in between the opening and closing tag of my element. So if my element here is this span, right, I have my opening tag and I have my closing tag, the inner HTML is the text between. And so all I have to do now is set this equal to 0. Sorry, this is text and this is a number, so we need to convert from a number to a string, and we can do that various ways, but this is one of them. So, whoops, count. This is special syntax for basically inserting a number here into our converting it from a number to a string. And if I save this and I go back and I press my button, you can now see that the counter is increasing. Right? So this is all possible because of being able to access elements through the DOM and then using event handlers to respond to some sort of action. Now, the last thing I want to do real quick is to show you actually creating elements, because right now we're just modifying one, but how do we create new elements and add them to our page? And so I have this add button here, which is this one, add element. And whenever I press this, I want a new paragraph to be added to my screen. So what's the first thing that I have to do in order to get some action attached to this button? What's the first thing that I'd have to add here? Anyone? How did we get the increment button? How did we get this set up?
The listener.
Yes, exactly, an event listener. And in order to do that, first we'll need to also write here add button and grab it from our DOM, right? So we need some reference. So get element by ID. And I have this ID here for my add button, which I can pop in. And now I can add a event handler to this by saying add button dot add event listener. Oops, let me add event listener, click, and then an arrow function. So now if I again do window.alert, just put some random string in here, and I press this button, right? Now my button is connected to some event. Okay. And so the last thing is, how do we create new elements? So what I said is I want a paragraph to appear on my screen whenever I press this button. Well, we can use, again, this document object, this the DOM, and we can say document dot create element. And in here, we pass in the tag of the element that we want to add. So if we want to add a paragraph to our page, then we'll need to put a P here. And this actually returns then a reference to the paragraph that we made. So I can say like const new element equals this. And now I have access to the element I made. And so just like before now, where I set my inner HTML to set the text, I can do the same thing. And I can say like new element dot inner HTML equals, let's just say new item. Right? So now I have my new element here, but now I want to insert it into my HTML, right? So I've created this element and we have a reference to it, but how do I add it to my page? Well, I created this empty div here, and this has an ID of container, and let's say that that's what I want to add to. So if I want to add something, I need a reference to it. So I can say const container equals, again, document.getElement by ID. Sorry, I'm typing slightly fast here because I know we're running low on time, so I want to make sure you see this. Container now is, sorry, container is now an object reference. Now we have this div in our code, and all you have to do now is just say container.append new element. Right? So to prove that this works, if I go back here and I press add element, right, you can now see that we've created a new paragraph element. We've inserted it into our div, and that completes kind of the adding and actually directly modifying our web page by inserting elements to the DOM. Right? And I think, let's see, yes. So that is this here. And I will send maybe some more information on how to actually remove elements because we haven't talked about that. But that is all that I had for this particular lecture. So the main thing here is we finally begin to connect HTML and TypeScript together. We can now directly add functionality to our page. And the next assignment, you will be using event handlers to actually get a pixel art maker art tool working using just event handlers. So that'll be sent out next week. Hope you all have a great weekend.